Welcome to another episode of Beyond Death, the podcast that aims to demystify things surrounding post-mortem imaging, celebrate pioneers in the field of post-mortem services, and individuals making really exciting moves within the communities they serve. We really think you'll enjoy this episode. We're joined by a very special guest, and I'm going to hand over to Asanda, who's going to tell us more. So Asanda, who do we have with us today?
Well, David, Dr. Mark Weiner has over 40 years' experience as a radiographer and radiology manager in London hospitals. He's currently senior lecturer in forensic radiography at Cranfield University Forensic Institute, as well as a senior teacher in radiography at Barts and the London School of Medicine. He has an extensive and impressive history in the world of forensics. He was formerly chief executive of the Enforce Foundation, a charity promoting development of international standards and training in the forensic investigation of war crimes and mass fatality incidents. He is a founder board member of both the International Association of Forensic Radiographers and the International Society of Forensic Radiology and Imaging. He has worked as an advisor to the Government Office for London, the Home Office, and the UN International Criminal Court. He's internationally recognised for his work in forensic radiography and has published many scientific papers and textbook chapters. And we are simply delighted to have him today on our episode. Welcome.
Hi. Welcome. We, Dr. Weiner, we have given you our introduction of what we think you do, but tell us in your own words what it is that you do, Ben. Thank you so much.
That's a very good question. What do I do? Yeah, I mean, I'm a radiographer, first and foremost. And how did I get into the wonderful world of forensics? I guess like many radiographers, you come into contact with forensic sciences very regularly. But it was one of the things that always interested me. And I've pursued it over the years, which we'll probably explore during the course of this podcast. Pursued it over the years, and it became a bit of a hobby, really, because over the last sort of 40 years or so, there weren't really many mainstream jobs in forensics. And so I pursued it, and I realised that there was a need for training and development in that field. And I guess over the last 20 years, I've become very involved in that. You mentioned my work with the Enforce Foundation, specifically on the investigation of mass graves. And so it's something that I've pursued. And I've also become aware that as a profession, radiographers and radiologists don't know very much about examining the dead or how to do it properly, or indeed how the police service works and how the whole forensic thing works. And so I guess I've tried to help demystify that. So what I do today, I've got a number of part-time jobs. Actually, I'm very lucky. I'm sort of semi-retired, and I can do the things that I like doing rather than things I have to do to pay the bills. I work part-time at Cranfield University, where I run the module in forensic radiography. And it's really an introduction to forensic radiography for all different disciplines, from forensic archaeologists, anthropologists, forensic ballistic experts, forensic investigators, scenes of crime officers as we might know them, radiographers as well. And it gives people an introduction to what imaging can do and how they might use it. So that's my role there. But I also work as a radiographer and I also teach in the dental school. So I teach undergraduate dentists. So I do all sorts of crazy things, which at my age I probably shouldn't be doing a lot of. But hey, there we go, keeps me going.
It really sounds like you got to do lots of exciting things. I guess probably talk about each of these in a bit more detail then. So you mentioned that you started off as a radiographer. What was it that made you make that transition from being a radiographer and going into imaging, post-mortem imaging?
Yeah, I was always, as a radiographer, I was always tended to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I ended up being involved in a number of major incidents at that time. And we this was the late 80s, early 90s. We had a lot of terrorist incidents in and around London. And I just happened to be working at those hospitals that were involved in them. And as a result of that, the aftermath was dealing, not only with the injured that came through the accident emergency departments, but also the deceased. And like a lot of people, are sort of asked to do things, and you think, what are we doing here? Someone brings a little bag along to the X-ray department. In those days, they just brought a sort of black bag. It was sealed. They put it in front of you. So, want an X-ray of this? Well, what is it? And how are we actually going to get a sensible X-ray if I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing? And that led to a sort of conversation about what is it we're trying to do? And listening to, police surgeons, police officers, pathologists, and having a sort of dialogue about what is it that we're actually wanting to see here, and thinking about how we then better apply the imaging. That started out, and I started talking to other colleagues at other hospitals, and the issue was very much the same. You're working in A&E, something like this happens, how do you deal with it? Not just in terms of the deceased, but the living, because the living come in from a crime scene, and they may come in with items of evidence on them that fall off, in the X-ray room or in the emergency room. What do you do with that? I mean, it's evidence. It should be backed up. It should be dealt with. And so we tried to raise awareness of that through what was then the trauma imaging group, and then we formed a subcommittee, which was the forensic subcommittee, which sort of took on those issues. But it really was at that time just addressing, the working radiographer in an emergency department, how you deal with those particular things. So I guess that's how I got into it. The next sort of big thing that really happened, and this is, I think, where it all sort of came together. I answered the telephone one day, which is something you should never really do, I've decided. Yes, you do all sorts of stuff. But I answered the telephone, and it was a pathologist on the other end. He said, "Oh, can I speak to Seth?" So I said, "Well, I'm pretty she's not here, she's retired. I've taken over, I'm in charge of the department now." And he said, "Well, I wonder if you could help me. I'm working with the War Crimes Tribunal in Yugoslavia, and we have a radiography machine here. We've got a fluoroscope here, and we need someone to use it. And we've got one radiographer, but he's going back to Switzerland, and I thought you might be able to help." So, of course, I had lots of questions. Well, what is it you're doing? What do you want? Et cetera, et cetera. And I thought, well, okay, we'll see what we can do. Asked around, and everyone decided they'd much rather go and work in a war zone than work in a hospital in the NHS. She ended up sending out a team of people, and myself and my colleague went out in the sort of first instance, and it was very, very confusing, I think. And not only did we not know what we were doing, but I don't think any of the other professionals really knew what radiography and radiology could do, and how it might be used in that investigation. And that then mushroomed a whole load more questions in my mind, and we sort of came back and tried to address those, in terms of our profession, how we train people and how we educate other professions about what we can do.
So it really did start off with a phone call, as they do say.
It did. It started with a phone call. Yeah.
So I think when you were describing sort of your experience working around in different London hospitals, you also mentioned that you had also had experience to bombings at the time of the 80s.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about that and what that experience was like.
I mean, there were a number of bombings, and it really depended on sort of how they were handled, really. Certainly in the late 80s and 90s, we had a series and I remember one vividly, which was the Victoria Station bomb. And I was working at the old Westminster Hospital at the time. And I took a train into Victoria Station every day. And this particular day, I couldn't get on the train because something had happened. And the IRA had put a device in a litter bin at Victoria Station. And there were a number of casualties. And I think one or two people lost their lives. I don't think one. But obviously, the first thing that happens, and the local hospital gets sort of swamped with casualties. And they declare an incident, so they clear the department. But by the time I managed to get in, as superintendent of the A&E department, most of the living had actually been attended to. They had been taken up to theatres. So the whole principle of this sort of tide of people that moved, it was suddenly panic in the A&E department. By the time I arrived, it was panic in theatres. They were all going to have bits of bomb and stuff removed from them. And then it was sort of panic elsewhere. And towards the end of the day, there were then these bizarre requests from the pathologists at the local mortuary. We've got a couple of people here. We need to look for bomb fragments. Can you X-ray them? Which we did, and they brought them over to the hospital, and we conducted an X-ray examination of them. Something which I'd not really done. I'd done things in black bags before, but I'd not actually seen a full body, as it were, sort of laid out on the X-ray table. And of course, you did it after hours. I didn't want to scare the rest of the patients. But it was after that we had a guy from the anti-terrorist division at Scotland Yard come and speak to all of us in the A&E department about the importance of preserving evidence and putting procedures in place to recognise the fact that we've got people coming in from a crime scene, and how do you deal with the evidence? What happens if bits fall off? Well, you bag them, you make sure that you alert the police, and you hand those things over to them. Because at the time, these devices they were using were quite primitive, and the timing mechanisms were being made from little clockwork timers. And they reckoned at the time that they could actually determine exactly where this bomb had been made by looking at the way that the timer had been constructed. Because there was almost like a sort of cottage industry putting these things together in various places. And so by looking at the time mechanism, they could determine who'd actually constructed the device. So that was really interesting, but obviously it was at the end of a day which had been quite traumatic in terms of the response that the hospital had to make.
Gosh, that sounds like a rather sort of relatively traumatic experience to have had at the time. So then tell us how you dealt with things after that then. So was there a debrief, for example, and then what were the next steps that happened following incidents like this?
Yeah, so, as always, you learn from these incidents, and I don't think, I've been involved in a number of major incidents, but I don't think any of them are ever quite the same. And the things that you learn from the previous one, you put into place for the next one, and, that's great, but you find there's something else you ought to have done. We had a debrief, and that was, there was a short debrief at the end of the day, which was, I think, more about making sure everyone was okay. And then there was sort of effectively a full debrief in A&E in sort of the next week, where we went through, how we might have handled things better and what the problems were. And a lot of it was around sort of documentation and stuff. And one of the things that we did then was to make sure, actually, we need to make up some packs. This is all, these in the days of paper, but if you prepare things and you have like a sort of zipped up bag, which has got all your forms and everything you're going to need, put to one side, that when the incident happens, it's all ready, it's all prepared for you. You're not scrabbling around for staples and stuff like that. Things have changed and moved on a bit with electronics, but there are always things that you learn from that. In terms of personally dealing with it, it's one of those things with forensics, and I'm dealing with the dead, really. I'm really sort of passionate about, which is that people should only do it if they feel able to do it. I don't think it's one of those things that you should really be sort of pressed into. It will affect people in different ways. I'm actually very good at sort of compartmentalizing stuff, but one of the things that I have seen, is if you are able to imagine the individual and their life, and imagine them with a wife and kids and all the rest of it, and see them as a person, it makes it much, much more difficult when you're doing the post-mortem examination. If you're able to just look at it at that moment as a body, as a scientific investigation, and compartmentalize that, then that is much easier to deal with. And I think that the people that I've seen who've had problems have been the ones that perhaps have got involved with the identification process and putting names and lives to people that they've subsequently or previously dealt with in the mortuary situation. And really, it's probably better if those two aspects are done by separate people. I've never, touch wood, have a problem with it. I do think that part of this work that I do over the last sort of 20 years, of trying to encourage other people to have better standards and stuff, it's actually part of my way of coping with the PTSD, I suspect. Compassionate in other ways.
Absolutely. It sounds like these things are certainly very, very traumatic. And like you said, there are a lot of coping mechanisms that people may have or they may need to employ to deal with certain things like this. And it can be quite traumatic, as you say. Now, you mentioned earlier on that you were as you started as a radiographer, but you also had to have a link with forensics. Now, how did you find making that transition between being relatively clinical and how your role fitted in with the legal side of things?
Yeah, it was quite difficult in a way because, as I say, as a radiographer or radiologist in a hospital, you don't do that many sort of forensic cases where you actually really get involved with the police, and quite often you never actually find what the outcome of your investigation was, or that was the way it used to be. So it wasn't really until I started doing the war crimes investigations that I actually understood the process. And in that situation, I was working in a mortuary with police experts, forensic pathologists, forensic anthropologists. Sometimes we'd have the archaeologists coming in from the exhumation sites. We had other experts, paleontologists and all sorts of ologists. And I began to see how it sort of fitted together and how, radiography and radiology was used by the pathologist and the anthropologist, and also by the odontologist, the forensic dentist, and how the police then brought that all together, and why it was important that we had our procedures around, correct identification of the remains and continuity of evidence, and why it all mattered, and it sort of fell into place. And I guess the one thing that really made a really big impression on me was that whilst we were investigating these war crimes, we had a team there to do that. There was a UN helicopter crashed very, very near to us with a number of important diplomats and people on it. And we were asked to do the identification. So it was actually a mass fatality incident, closed mass fatality incident, not that many. Yeah, we got involved. I understood the process, and I understood how we went through it. It was all charted, and it was up on a big sort of spreadsheet on the wall, and they went through and they did by process of building up the different aspects, looking at the dental records and looking at the physical attributes of the individual, and looking at the various maturation of the skeleton and all the rest of it. They were able to determine which individual was which, and I thought, this is interesting. I wonder how we do this back home. How do we do this in the UK? How is radiography involved in that? Because I was unaware of any sort of team or anything that did that. How do we mobilise that? How do we put people in temporary mortuary? Who does it? And I came back and I sort of looked at the lessons that were learned from Lockerbie, where local radiographers had just sort of been pulled in and actually were traumatised as a result of it, and had thought, we were doing this until the army turns up. But of course, the army never did turn up, and they carried on doing it. And so I sort of came back and thought, well, we ought to try and do something about this. We ought to, as a profession, get out there and say, this is what we can do as radiologists and radiographers. This is how it ought to fit into your process. And actually, if you look internationally at all the different papers that have been done up to that point, it was quite clear how radiography could be used. But in order to do it, you've got to have a plan. You can't just say, we're going to take an X-ray machine into a mortuary next week. You've got to think about issues like radiation protection. You've got to think about how it fits in with the rest of the procedures. And so that sort of set us on a mission in the UK, really, to sort of educate people and say, well, okay, if we're going to do this, which we probably are in a mass fatality incident, how do we do it? And how do we plan for it? Did that answer your question? I feel I went off with a tangent there.
Well, I think you absolutely.
No, it's amazing. We could listen to you talk for actually quite some time. Your CV and your stories are just incredible. I also had a few questions I wanted to ask.
Sure.
And they're sort of less academic, but I was very curious, given your extensive training and experience. What is your proudest moment you've had in your professional career?
Oh, wow. That is a really difficult one. My proudest moment? I don't know. There have been so many. I mean, I don't know.
Maybe you could give me top three.
I'm really trying to think. I guess, I suppose that one that sticks out, but only because it was a really sort of big incident, and that was the 7/7 London bombings. And as a result of this work that I was talking about sort of coming back from Bosnia in sort of 1998 and asking questions about how we prepare in this country for mass fatality incidents, and specifically how radiology prepares itself. Myself and a number of colleagues, through what was then the Trauma Imaging Group and then later became the Association of Forensic Radiographers, set out and put a team together. We said, well, if no one else is doing this, we're going to do it ourselves. So we trained radiographers to understand the whole issues of continuity of evidence and mass fatality incidents and identification. And we worked with a number of regions, particularly in north of England and also in London, to work with emergency planners and say, well, okay, if something happens, not only can we now provide the personnel, but where are we getting the equipment from? And we put in a plan to try and at least beg, borrow or steal equipment. And that was written into the London Mass Fatality Plan, which was published in June of 2005. And 7 days later, there was that suicide bombing attack on the London Underground. And we put the plan into operation, and it worked. And we were able to call, I think we had something like 27 radiographers from all over the country over a 3-week period. It worked really well. We managed to get the equipment from the equipment companies. The whole thing worked like clockwork. So that was a very proud moment, actually. Not just myself, but the members of that team, did an amazing job. And it was something that had directly come out of all that work that we'd done. So that was, I guess that was probably one. I'm trying to think of the others, but there are lots.
Amazing. Yeah.
It is, but it's one of those things that you keep looking on and you think, we need to do this because it's important to do it, but you never really imagine that it's actually going to be used. Do you know what I mean? And then it is, and then it works, which is even better. I mean, how many things do you plan and do stuff, and then it all falls apart,
Exactly, but it comes together, which is the cherry on the cake, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just seeing from your CV as well that you've done work with the UN, and
yes.
I mean, I don't know anybody who has, so I'm very curious. Are you able to tell us a little bit about your work at the UN?
Absolutely, yeah. So, having been asked to go out to Bosnia in 96, I then worked with the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia for the next 6 years or so, because they, like us, I mean, we went out, didn't know what we're supposed to be doing. They really didn't have a clue about how these things should be investigated. They knew what specialists they needed. But of course, they'd assembled a team of specialists from all over the world. So you had people from the UK who were used to using one process, criminal investigative process, and you had people from Germany, and you had people from South America, and people from the Far East, etc. And nobody really understood radiography. So at the end of the first year, they said, well, can you help us again next year? And I said, well, okay, yeah, but I think we need to make some changes, and you need to perhaps have this equipment and that equipment. Can we get this? Right, okay, can you write us a list of what we need? So we put a basic equipment list together. And over the course of the next 2-3 years, we actually managed to get a lot of that kit put into place. We built up protocols so that we were, using it in the same manner, whoever was using it, and that it fitted in nicely to the investigative process. Now, once the ICTY, as it then was, had sort of finished its investigative work, they formed the International Criminal Criminal Court. And again, they said, well, we need to set something up here, and will you help us put something together? So my advice was really all around the equipment, the X-ray equipment that they would need, and the protocols and procedures. So I advised them on the kit, which they then purchased, went over and sort of commissioned it, set it up. I don't think it was used that much, I have to say. The emphasis shifted away from sort of physical forensic evidence for a while in international investigations. I think it's now swinging back, and I was at a meeting the other day with the ICC, and they're looking again to try and use more forensic input, because they sort of moved away and rely a lot more on sort of witness testimony and stuff, which I don't think has proved helpful in some cases. So that was really interesting. And again, as with all these things, it comes from that initial telephone call and that initial contact, and meeting and discussing with people and realizing that actually these things aren't as organized as we might imagine they are. So in United Nations International Investigating Team, you'd assume, wouldn't you, that someone had thought through the whole issues of evidence and how it was going to be presented.
Exactly.
But no. It's better now.
Wow, better for having you there. I would also say it would be easily accepted for someone who's done as much as you have to sort of sit back and say, right, that's it. I've left a great legacy, but I see that you are a senior lecturer at Cranfield University, and you are a senior tutor at Barts and the London School of Medicine and Dentistry. How did you become a lecturer? What influenced you to that path?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I've always enjoyed teaching, and it was something that I always did as a radiographer. I always sort of taught, in the School of Radiography and later at City University, and so I've always enjoyed it. And then I did a project job for quite a while, and I sort of kept my hand in with radiography, doing other stuff, and obviously I was always doing the forensic things. And that project job came to an end, and I thought, what do I want to do at this point? I'm sort of, at that point, 7 years away from retirement. I actually want to pursue my interest, which is around forensic imaging. So I'd sort of done some part-time work at Cranfield, but the opportunity came up to actually take on the module, and I thought, well, yeah, that's great. That's what I really want to do. So let's do that. Frankly, I needed something else to sort of fill the gap. I again just happened to be talking to an ex-colleague of mine who was saying, well, I'm thinking of decreasing my hours in the dental school. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because I'm really interested in coming to do some teaching. And of course, it sits very nicely with forensics, because of forensic odontology and teeth, I find it fascinating anyway. And so somehow I ended up teaching the dental school as well, and decided at the same crazy time to go off and do a PhD by published work, which has proved to be useful, but I'm not sure I would ever recommend that anyone did it quite so late in life, frankly. I think my brain is still hurting from the experience.
Well, it's done now, so you can look back and be proud of that. So exactly, we've said that you are a lecturer, but is there anything else we should look out for? What's next for you, or how do you see the next few years going for you?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the sort of legacy thing. I mean, I have a bit of a problem letting go of things, but I am trying to sort of step back, because I think it's important that, the next generation actually get in there and take things on and carry on the good work, really. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to sort of take a bit of a backseat, but be there in a supporting role. And the Cranfield teaching role is great, because we're getting lots of new young blood through the system, and it's great to be able to pass on knowledge to them and see them go forward and develop. And a lot of those people that have been on the course have been forensic anthropologists. Some of them actually gone off and subsequently trained and done master's degrees in radiography, and they're now using both specialisms. And of course, being a radiographer and an anthropologist is very helpful. But actually seeing the way that post-mortem imaging is going with CT being rolled out across not only this country but across many other countries is really exciting. So next for me, I think, is sort of keeping my hand in with that and supporting stuff as it happens. I'm also trying to write a book, which is a sort of autobiography. So that's
wow.
That's in progress at the minute. But as with all of these things,
Brilliant.
if you come to my care home in about 40 years' time, you'll probably find I'm still writing it. But that's the next task.
Fantastic.
No, it sounds so exciting actually to hear about this, and we actually can't wait to read it when it's out. So,
exclusive, everybody.
Yeah, we're exclusive, absolutely.
Absolutely here first. So, Dr. Viner, a question we like to ask all our guests, one of our final questions we like to ask our guests, is about understanding and what is a common misconception about their role. If there is one thing in particular that you would like to demystify about what it is that you do, what is it? And would you like to explain to us what it is?
That's interesting. Yeah, I think if you say to people that you're a forensic radiographer, maybe even a forensic radiologist, I don't think they really have a clue what it involves. That the word forensic obviously sounds really interesting. Oh, gosh, that's fascinating. What do you do? And it is really such an interesting field, and so very, very wide, actually. It's anything from determining the cause of death to evaluating injuries to identifying the deceased. I don't know. I mean, I think it's the absolute scale of it, isn't it? Because those two words actually encapsulate a whole range of technology and procedures, which is very difficult to convey to people in a short space of time. So misconception that you just deal with the dead, because forensic radiology is applied to the living equally as to the dead. So I suppose that if I ask what's the main misconception, I think forensic always, a lot of people just think dead, and that's not the case.
No, absolutely. Actually, I think you've summed it up very nicely there, because there is so much more to things beyond just dealing with the dead, like you said.
Mm.
So, Dr. Viner, thank you so much for your time. We have absolutely enjoyed hearing all your stories. We've absolutely enjoyed hearing about your experiences. We've learned a lot from this discussion today, and we have we're looking forward to hearing about your autobiography, reading it when it does come out eventually. And we're excited to see what's next for you. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
For our listeners, actually, for listening through to this, we hope you've enjoyed this episode. This episode has focused a bit on forensic radiography, and we look forward to joining you on our next episode. So this may be the end of our conversation with Dr. Mark Weiner, but it's certainly not the end of the discussion surrounding what matters beyond death.
Beyond death.